They built fleets that darkened suns. What they never built was their own life support. When War Master Krell prepared to crush the human frontier, he expected a diplomat to beg. Instead, a man in a grease-stained jumpsuit walked into the council chamber, carrying a toolbox. The council laughed. Then the lights flickered. Just once. Silas Vane didn't threaten them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Declaring war voided your maintenance priority." Across Zeta Prime, the first atmospheric scrubber shifted into uncalibrated mode. The Zidani had 10,000 warships, but not a single engineer who knew how to fix their own air. The tool of empire. Silas Vane didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who was late for a shift. As he stood in the heart of the Zidani capital, he ignored the snarling guards and the massive display of the Zidani fleet moving toward the human frontier. "War Master," Silas said, his voice flat and mechanical. "You've spent 3 centuries expanding, but in those 3 centuries you haven't produced a single engineer who knows how a Phase 4 reactor works. We hired us to build them because we were cheap and efficient." Krell clicked his mandibles in amusement. "You are our servants, human. We own the reactors. We own the fuel. You are irrelevant." Silas didn't flinch. He just opened his toolbox and pulled out a small glowing diagnostic probe. "You own the hardware, Krell, but we own the maintenance cycle, and your subscription just expired." The oxygen debt. Krell leaned down, his massive mechanical eye whirring. "You threaten us with maintenance? Our ships will be at your frontier in 6 hours. They will burn your oxygen hubs and leave your people to choke in the vacuum." This was the emotional anchor, the frontier families who lived and breathed only because of the machines Silas had built. Silas finally looked up, his eyes cold. "I'm not here to talk about my hubs, Krell. I'm here to talk about yours. Your homeworld, Zeta Prime, has a population of 12 billion. Every single one of them breathes through the atmospheric scrubbers my company installed last year. Scrubbers that require a proprietary chemical catalyst, one that only my office has the synthesis code for." The 10-minute stall. The laughter in the chamber died instantly. A low-frequency hum began to resonate through the walls, the sound of the spire's own ventilation fans slowing down. Silas checked his diagnostic probe. "That's the first stage of the default protocol. In 10 minutes, the scrubbers on this planet will enter safety lockdown. They won't restart until they receive an encrypted handshake from Earth's central server." Krell roared, his armor sparking with rage. "You threaten us with maintenance? Our ships will be at your frontier in 6 hours. They will burn your oxygen hubs and leave your people to choke in the vacuum." This was the emotional anchor, the frontier families who lived and breathed only because of the machines Silas had built. Silas finally looked up, his eyes cold. "I'm not here to talk about my hubs, Krell. I'm here to talk about yours. Your homeworld, Zeta Prime, has a population of 12 billion. Every single one of them breathes through the atmospheric scrubbers my company installed last year. Scrubbers that require a proprietary chemical catalyst, one that only my office has the synthesis code for." The strategic freeze. The countdown on Silas's probe hit 0700. Across the Zidani network, primary systems began to flicker. It wasn't just the air, it was the power grids, the automated kitchens, and the waste disposal systems. The Zidani had built a civilization on stolen tech, but they had outsourced the soul of their world to the humans they despised. "War Master," Silas said, his voice echoing in the cooling room, "you can send your fleet to the frontier. They can burn our hubs, but by the time the first shot is fired, your own capital will be a tomb. You'll be the king of a graveyard, breathing your last stale liter of air while you watch your ships burn a world you could have lived in." The stuttering engine. The countdown hit the 6-minute mark and a new, discordant sound filled the chamber. A metallic, grinding whine from the spire's primary power core. High War Master Krell slammed his claw into his command console, trying to force a manual override. "This is a bluff," he roared. "Our ships have their own internal scrubbers. They don't need your codes." Silas didn't even look up from his diagnostic probe. "Correct, War Master. They have internal scrubbers, but they also have Mark 7 hyper-injectors, the ones my team installed during your last refit in the Sol shipyards." Silas tapped a command and a secondary holographic display showed the Zidani fleet in transit. The injectors are currently running at 90% capacity. In 3 minutes, they'll trigger a scheduled maintenance cycle. They won't explode, they'll just coast at sub-light speeds. It'll take your fleet 80 years to reach our frontier, the logistics of a siege. Krell's massive mechanical eye whirred frantically. "You sabotaged our fleet!" Silas shook his head, his voice maintaining its documentary-style authority. "I didn't sabotage anything. I just didn't sign the safety waiver for the high-stress maneuvers you're attempting. You're pushing the engines past their certified limits without a human technician on board to balance the thermal load." Silas stepped closer to the War Master's dais, his heavy work boots echoing on the metal floor. "Your soldiers are sitting in those ships right now, watching their consoles turn yellow. They know that if they keep pushing, the engines will simply lock. They're professional killers, Krell, but they aren't stupid. They know when they've been out-engineered. The Zidani panic." The visible authority shift began to ripple through the council. Lesser War Masters were now ignoring Krell, hunched over their own personal comlinks, receiving frantic reports from their home estates. "The automated factories on Zeta Secundus have stopped. The waste reclamation systems are backing up. The city levels are flooding with gray water." Silas watched the chaos with a detached gaze of a foreman watching a predictable accident. "The Zidani Hegemony is a marvel of biological engineering, but you built your cities like a body without a nervous system. We provided the nerves, and right now I'm the only one who can stop the tremors." He checked his probe. 0430. The air in the chamber was noticeably warmer now, the smell of recycled metal growing thick and stale, the price of a handshake. Krell's armor let out a hiss of escaping steam. His own internal cooling system was starting to fail as the spire's external support weakened. He looked down at Silas, his mandibles quivering with a mix of rage and suffocating heat. "What do you want, human?" Silas pulled a small physical data chip from his pocket, a legacy key. "I want the immediate stand-down of your vanguard. I want a 100-year exclusivity contract for all infrastructure maintenance in the hegemony. And I want the terraforming hubs on our frontier designated as neutral critical infrastructure, protected by Zidani law." Silas held the chip up, the blue light reflecting off his grease-stained face. "Sign the service agreement, Krell, or find out how long 12 billion people can hold their breath." The countdown on Silas's diagnostic probe hit the 3-minute mark, and the Zidani spire groaned. It wasn't just the air anymore. The grav plates beneath the council's feet began to fluctuate, shifting from a crushing 2.0 Gs to a nauseating weightlessness. High War Master Krell gripped his throne, his biomechanical limbs sparking as they struggled to compensate for the erratic physics. You are a murderer," Krell gasped, the thin, hot air making every word a struggle. Silas stood perfectly balanced, his heavy magnetic work boots locked firmly to the deck. "I'm a technician, Krell," Silas replied, his voice a calm, documentary-style drone. "When you stop paying for the safety protocols, the laws of physics are the first thing to quit. Your palace is held together by human magnetic shunts. Without the handshake, they're just metal." The vanguard's silence. On the primary wall screen, the Zidani fleet had stopped moving entirely. They were drifting in the void, their massive purple engines dark and cold. A frantic audio transmission cut through the static of the chamber, the voice of the Grand Admiral. "War Master, the hyper-injectors have entered a hard lock. We are dead in space.
We have life support for 4 hours, but our navigation computers they're asking for a human password." Silas didn't look at the screen. He kept his eyes on Krell. The Grand Admiral is a pragmatist. He's currently calculating the oxygen-to-soldier ratio. In about 5 minutes, he's going to realize that the only way to save his crew is to surrender to the very human outposts he was sent to destroy. The mutiny of the merchants. The secondary war masters, the ones who managed the Hegemony's vast industrial estates, finally reached their breaking point. One by one, they retracted their loyalty pikes from the central dais. "Krell, you have led us into a vacuum," the trade lord of Zida Secundus hissed, his chitinous plates clicking in a rhythmic sign of surrender. "Our factories are silent. Our cities are choking. We will not follow a leader who cannot even provide his people with air." The physical hierarchy of the Zidani exploded. The council members began to abandon the dais, moving towards the emergency exits, leaving Krell standing alone atop his sparking, dying throne. The authority shift was absolute and visible. The countdown hit 0100. The lights in the spire flickered one last time and died, leaving only the blue glow of Silas's diagnostic probe and the faint dying embers of Krell's mechanical eye. The War Master looked down at the human, not as a slave, but as the only being in the galaxy who could let him breathe again. With a trembling, clawed hand, Krell reached out and touched the glowing data chip Silas held. The terms," Krell whispered, his voice a mechanical rasp. "I accept." Silas didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply slotted the chip into the console. "Good choice, War Master. I'll send you the invoice for the emergency call-out."
The breath of life. As the signature hit the digital ledger, a massive resonant thrum shook the spire. The silence was replaced by the sudden, violent rush of air. The heavy, metallic smell of stagnant oxygen was swept away by a cool, pine-scented breeze, the standard Earth-spec air filtration. High War Master Krell slumped back into his throne, his biomechanical armor depressurizing with a long, exhausted hiss. Across the Hegemony, the lights didn't just flicker back on. They changed. The harsh, aggressive red of the Zidani military state was gone, replaced by the steady, clinical blue of the human systems integration. Silas Vane didn't celebrate. He just picked up his toolbox. "Air is back at 100%, Krell," he said, his voice echoing in the now functional chamber. "But remember, I can still hear the fans from Earth." The Vanguard's new command. On the primary wall screen, the Zidani fleet began to move again, but their formation had changed. The aggressive V-shape of a conquest vanguard had collapsed into a defensive perimeter around the human frontier stations. The Grand Admiral's face appeared on the screen, no longer snarling, but standing at a stiff, terrified attention. "The hyper-injectors have been reset," the Admiral reported, his eyes fixed on Silas rather than his own War Master. "We are assuming protective positions around the terraforming hubs, as per the new service agreement." Silas nodded once. He knew that for the families on the frontier, the sight of Zidani dreadnoughts was no longer a death sentence. They were now the most expensive security guards in the galaxy. The auditor's exit. Silas Vane walked toward the massive obsidian doors of the chamber. The Zidani guards, who had once leveled pikes at his throat, now stepped back, their chitinous plates clicking in a gesture of submissive recognition. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at the council. They were no longer a war council. They were a board of directors who had just lost a hostile takeover. "You thought our weakness was our lack of a fleet, but your weakness was thinking a machine is just a tool. A machine is a relationship, and you've been very bad partners." He stepped out into the bright light of the hallway, leaving the Zidani to contemplate the cost of their own survival. The master of the works. The small human shuttle lifted off from Zidar Prime, a solitary spark against the dark mechanical crust of the alien capital. Inside, Silas Vane sat in a cramped industrial seat, his hands finally shaking as the adrenaline faded.
He didn't call the president. He didn't order a parade. He opened his data slate and pulled up the maintenance schedule for a small oxygen pump on a backwater human moon. He tapped a few keys, checked the pressure levels, and closed the screen. The war was over, not because of a grand speech or a heroic sacrifice, but because a man with a toolbox knew exactly which bolt to loosen. As the stars blurred into hyperspace, Silas finally allowed himself a small, weary smile. The galaxy was a machine, and for the first time in history, humanity was the one holding the manual.